In January of 2015, Governor Dayton announced that he was interested in having a requirement across the state of Minnesota for a 50-foot buffer to be installed next to all waterways of the state. He did so on the basis that he maintains that it was maybe your property, but it's our water. And so he wanted to make sure that he would have the ability to deal with water quality issues that he felt were going to be improved using this buffer mandate. He also had envisioned that the process would include the Department of Natural Resources being the regulatory agency and using their regulatory authority and penalty provisions in order to enforce that 50-foot buffer. During the session, legislation was introduced that basically followed that particular outline for what the governor had wanted. None of the bills passed either of the House or the Senate, and actually only one of the bills in the Senate was able to pass any committee. And so even though we went into the final days of the legislative session with no legislation having been adopted by either the House or the Senate, the decision was made in conference committee to insert an amendment that ended up being part of the final package. That final package includes requirements on landowners to have 16.5-foot perennial vegetative buffers next to ditches that are benefited by public drainage systems, and a 50-foot average of perennial vegetative buffer with a 30-foot minimum for all property that abuts public waterways. All agricultural property owners who have property that is adjacent to a ditch that benefits from a public drainage system will be required to have a perennial vegetative buffer of 16.5 feet by November 1st of 2018. And then for any property owner who has agricultural property that is adjacent to waters determined to be public waters, they will need to have a 50-foot average perennial buffer with a 30-foot minimum, and that will need to be installed by November 1st of 2017. Well, we were very active throughout the legislative session trying to call attention to the importance of maintaining and recognizing and following private property rights. In the original bills that were introduced, we were adamantly opposed and spoke accordingly in testimony before the legislative committees. We also had our members that were very involved in contacting their legislators to make sure that they heard that private property does matter, and that this was not going to work, especially on the basis of just applying this type of a government mandate across the state on a one-size-fits-all basis. So we were active. In the end, we were involved in discussions with the governor's office to try to find some type of a compromise, and in the legislative process, as the final days of the session ended, we were also involved in accepting the language that became part of the final package. I think with the way that the requirements come out that local authorities are responsible, whether it be a county government or whether it be a watershed district, based on whatever the specific requirements are at a specific location, I think that it's going to be important that our local folks work with their local authorities and make sure that we have in place the appropriate types of details that fit what the requirements of the law are, and not going above and beyond, as I think state agencies are going to be trying to expand their authority beyond what the law says. But we need to focus on making sure that the law is adhered to and that local authorities take control of what needs to be done in their property. Landowners also need to have assurance that when they've met the obligations of meeting the buffers that they are required to have, that they get credit for that type of an approach. And I think our policy needs to reflect the idea that we are seeking a goal of 100% compliance within the timeframes, and that we want recognition of good conservation practices in all forms as we move forward on a voluntary basis as opposed to a regulatory one.